Thomas Paine's devastating quality was his constancy. We humans are not generally famous for our fidelity, even to ourselves, are we? Thomas Paine was faithfulness personified. He stayed with his towering democratic ideals to his bitter, bitter end. And in pursuing those uncompromising democratic ideals, he earned a vast volume of hatred and rejection from continents of human beings. He is a candidate for being the most valuable Englishman ever. And if that is true, why do so few British people even remember his name? Thomas Paine was born here, in this little town of Thetford in the county of Norfolk in England, on January the 29th, 1737. He was an only child, and he was brought up in the Quaker faith. But Tom could not follow the dictates of any creed except his own evolving humanitarian belief. At the age of 13 years, in 1750, Thomas Paine was taken away from this grammar school, and he began learning the trade of stay-making, to be a maker of ladies' corsets. Perhaps a not irrelevant beginning for a man who later in life was to fight for the decent rights of women. Tom Paine wandered uneasily around southern England, stay-making. He married, and his young wife died. Then, in the year 1761, he broke under the disturbing strain of corseting women, and he joined the excise service. He became a customs officer. And by the year 1768, he was stationed here at Lewes in the county of Sussex. This is the very house that he lodged in. However, it was at this White Hart Inn that his far-flung genius began to humbly bud. In this building, during Tom's residence in the town, there was a debating society, and he joined it, and he began to speak. Now, England at that time, and of course its vassal nations of Wales, Scotland, and ever-fighting Ireland, was bent into cruel social shapes by a class structure of awesome proportion. And it took a brave man to object. To object could mean transportation out of Greater Britain or even death. And to underline the agony, on the throne of England during that period were the unattractive, reactionary German kings ranging from George I to George IV. Thomas Paine was now 31 years old, and for most of those 31 years he had been watching and listening and thinking. And he had begun to arrive at a general conclusion regarding the proper rights of humankind. And it was here that he began to utter those opinions to the local people. One of the members of this debating society, a Mr. Lee, inscribed a verse about Tom's ability at this time. Thy logic vanquished error, and thy mind no bounds but those of right and truth confined. A humble poem meant for a few local townspeople, but as I will demonstrate, astoundingly prophetic. And then in 1772, Thomas Paine moved into the lethal field of practical national politics. Excise officers, customs men, were paid barely a living wage, and Tom composed his first political pamphlet, quote, "Poverty begets a degree of meanness that will stoop to almost anything. He who never was a hungered may argue finely on the subjection of his appetite." Tom was asking a simple, cogent question. How can you expect excise officers or anyone else to be honest if you keep them very poor? Thomas Paine took those words to the British Parliament. He begged and cajoled many members, but the excise men's lot was not improved, and Tom Paine, a very early trade unionist, was sacked from the excise service. Tom was now beginning to learn the rough reality of our human society, but thank God, as he was rejected by the men at the center of government, he was embraced by their betters outside of it. Oliver Goldsmith embraced him. And most importantly and significantly, the great American Benjamin Franklin recognized the quality of Tom Paine, and thereby did the incipient United States of America an incalculable good turn. Indeed, when Benjamin Franklin, in this very room, here in London, in the year 1774, held out his hand to Thomas Paine, it could soundly be argued that that event literally signified the true beginning of the great North American Republic. Benjamin Franklin looked closely at Thomas Paine, at the militant democratic qualities that Thomas Paine carried with him, and urged Tom to get the hell out of Britain and to sail immediately for America. Paine agreed and departed for this then colonial city of Philadelphia. He carried with him a letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin. The bearer, Mr. Thomas Paine, is very well recommended to me as an ingenious, worthy young man. By January 1775, Thomas had truly discovered the potential of the American way of life, and he quickly became the editor of the Pennsylvania Magazine. When he took that job on, the printer was selling 600 copies per month. 3 months later, the circulation had risen to 1,500 per month. What was Tom writing about that attracted American colonialists? Well, he wrote widely. He wrote an article titled African Slavery in America. He asked for the total abolition of slavery. This moral demand shocked and disturbed slave-owning Americans, but just 4 weeks later, hallelujah, the first American anti-slave organization was started. Here in Philadelphia, Tom Paine wrote about the moral rightness of a war of liberation. He wrote about the impossibility of unilateral pacifism, particularly when a country is occupied by an alien military presence, wherever that might be. He wrote, "I am thus far a Quaker that I would gladly agree with all the world to lay aside the use of arms and settle matters by negotiation. But unless the whole will, the matter ends. And I take up my musket and thank heaven that he has put it in my power." Amen. And Thomas Paine wrote about the rights of women, not about privileges for women at the price of injustice towards men and children, as much of today's feminist movement advocates, but something quite different: full humanitarian rights for all women. And Tom Paine even preceded Mary Wollstonecraft, that truly great feminist, in this very proper mission. And then, unexpectedly, from one extremity of the 13 British colonies in America to the other, revolution against England, the home country, began to erupt. The idealistic complaint that the American colonies leveled against England was carried in the slogan, "No taxation without representation." The Americans objected to being told how much tax they would have to pay by a British Parliament over in London, where they had no members of that Parliament. There were, of course, many other reasons why trouble was warming in America, but no taxation without representation was the overall rallying shout. And on this democratic issue, King George III was stubbornly unbending, and it was he who inspired the dispatch of additional British troops to the American colonies, where, here at this town of Lexington, indeed on this very green, some of those British soldiers came into conflict with armed American colonial militia. It has been debated that one of the Americans opened fire, and the British replied and killed 7 American colonialists. The date was April the 15th, 1775. But even after this shocking event, leading Americans urged appeasement with England. Benjamin Franklin, still over there in London, said, "No American, drunk or sober, has ever favored separation from the mother country." Thomas Jefferson stated, "I'm still looking with fondness towards a reconciliation with Great Britain." And George Washington was adamant. "If you ever hear of my joining in any such measures as separation from England, you have my leave to set me down for everything wicked." But our Tom, the sometime corset maker from Thetford in England, didn't see the deaths at Lexington and the royal politics that lay behind those deaths at all like Franklin, Jefferson, or Washington. Tom began to compose words which expressed exactly what he deeply felt. He turned first on George III, whom he ardently despised. "I reject the hardened, sullen-tempered King of England forever, who, with the pretended title of Father of his people, can unfeelingly hear of their slaughter and can composedly sleep with their blood upon his soul. Thomas Paine then began to compose a book of some 25,000 words, which he called Common Sense. And in this book, he asked Franklin, Jefferson, Washington, and indeed all of his now fellow colonial Americans to consider a towering concept. He asked them to consider the great ideal that America could become if they fought against King George III's England and achieved their American Republican independence. Tom wrote, "The sun never shone on a cause of greater worth. 'Tis not the concern of a day, a year, or an age. Posterity is virtually involved in the contest, and will be more or less affected even to the end of time by the proceedings now. Now is the seed time of American continental union, faith, and honor. Freedom hath been hunted round the globe. Asia and Africa have long expelled freedom. Europe regards freedom like a stranger, and England hath given freedom warning to depart. O America, receive the fugitive freedom and prepare in time an asylum for mankind." This short book, from which these extracts are taken, became an immediate and astounding success. It was estimated that at least 300,000 copies were sold, and Tom Paine refused to accept any money in reward. He said, "When writing on political and theological subjects, I should lose the spirit, the pride, and the pleasure of it, were I conscious that I looked for financial reward." Yep, you are a better man than I am, Thomas Paine. But what he did receive for his book was the satisfaction of creating, more than any other human being, the unification of the American colonies. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and a fair proportion of the American people, hearing Tom Paine, stopped vacillating and committed themselves to the awesome struggle of fighting the power and wealth of England. Even conservative George Washington said, "The sound doctrine and unanswerable reasoning in Thomas Paine's pamphlet is working a wonderful change in the minds of American men." An American Continental Congress was called for, and on July the 4th, 1776, that Congress passed their Declaration of Independence. The English philosopher and reformer William Cobbett stated, "Whoever may have actually written the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Paine was its real author." Paine worked through his close friend Thomas Jefferson in creating that famous document. But he suffered one tragic failure in spite of Jefferson's support. Tom begged the Americans to include in their declaration a clause which would abolish slavery. But the majority of the Americans involved refused to support this humane issue. And the new nation, and particularly the black slaves, would have to wait another 85 years for Abraham Lincoln to carry out Tom Paine's wishes by the means of a horrific and cruel civil war. And Tom Paine seriously risked his burgeoning popularity in America when he challenged his now fellow country people with the question, with what consistency or decency can we complain so loudly of attempts by the British to enslave us while we hold so many thousands of black people in slavery? Oh boy. Anyway, having rallied the American colonies to unite and fight, our hero Tom unobtrusively picked up a musket and joined General George Washington's army, which was, astonishingly enough, centered here on Manhattan. And this American army was almost entirely made up of half-trained, poorly armed volunteers. There were barely 8,000 of them, and they were facing, over there on Staten Island, General Sir William Howe and his 20,000 well-armed, well-fed, and professional British army. General Howe moved and hit the Americans and Tom Paine out of New York. And by December 1776, onto the western bank of this Delaware River, it was low ebb for Washington and his American army. They had been beaten and were now shivering in the ice and snow, waiting for General Howe and his British army to come across this river and to demonstrate the coup de grace. General George Washington stated, "Your imagination can scarce extend to a situation more distressing than mine. Our only American dependence now is upon the speedy enlistment of a new army. If this fails, our American game will be pretty well up." But on the other hand, Tom Paine, at night, after his soldierly duties were finished, turned his magic pen again, and he wrote a pamphlet which he chose to call Crisis. Tom Paine addressed his words primarily to the freezing American soldiers. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis turn from the service of his country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us. The harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. Let it be told to the future world that in the depth of winter, when nothing but hope and virtue could survive, the city and the country, alarmed at one common danger, came forth to meet and to repulse it. George Washington, standing with his beaten, frozen army of part-time soldiers and virtually waiting for awful defeat, read these words of Tom Paine, and in his stiff, inhibited manner murmured of my lively sense of the importance of Thomas Paine. And the revered American general gave orders for Tom's pamphlet to be read to his despairing men. The effect of this on their battered spirits was astounding. Many more Americans from the city and the country joined Washington's army. And just a few days after its publication, on Christmas Eve, 1776, Washington gave orders to be rowed across this Delaware River at the head of his small army, and they immediately made war on the superior British force. The American amateurs drove the British professionals out of Trenton and soundly defeated them under their leader, Lord Cornwallis. It is only fair to say that above all else, Thomas Paine's spirit was victorious. Admiral Lord Richard Howe, officer commanding the British fleet in American waters, began to sense a new invincible quality in the Americans who were challenging King George III's authority, and therefore his lordship offered an amnesty to the Americans if they would submit to the British king. Tom Paine replied on behalf of the American people, "By what means, may I ask, do you expect to conquer America? If you could not effect it in the summer, when our army was less than yours, nor in the winter when we had none, how are you to do it? In point of generalship, you have been outwitted, and in point of fortitude, outdone." And then the staymaker, the corset maker from Norfolk, England, easily lectured the famous English naval lord, and in doing so, invented the most famous title that perhaps any country has ever carried. Tom Paine predicted, quote, "the United States of America." Yes, it was the very first time that those words had been articulated ever. The United States of America will sound as pompously in the world and in history as the Kingdom of Great Britain. And so, after all of this monumental rallying of America, Thomas Paine on April the 17th, 1777, received some official American recognition. He was made a foreign secretary, though many Americans opposed the appointment because of his continuing fight for the abolition of slavery, etc., 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 etc. The American War of Independence dragged on. The problem for the Americans was now largely economic. Where to get money from to buy arms and supplies? Thomas Paine, with a vision of a statesman, suggested to the American revolutionary government that emissaries should be sent to France to ask for a loan of $8 million. The American Congress agreed, and Tom went on that mission, again receiving no salary, arriving in Paris during March 1781. King Louis XVI met the Republican Paine, and they liked each other. By August, Tom was back in America with 2 shiploads of military supplies and the balance made up in hard French cash. And also because of that mission to Paris, the French army in North America moved to support Washington's American soldiers, and these two combined armies marched towards Yorktown in Virginia and defeated the British force there under General Cornwallis. The Americans and their French allies were now clearly winning the War of Independence. As the British Army in the now United States of America capitulated and began to withdraw, Tom Paine issued another pamphlet. The times that tried men's souls are over, and the greatest and completest revolution the world ever knew is gloriously and happily accomplished. Let then the world see that America can bear prosperity and that her honest virtue in time of peace is equal to her bravest virtue in time of war. Of course, Thomas Paine had made many influential and rich enemies. He had cut across the ambitions and greed of important Americans. He had fought against slavery, by and large unsuccessfully, and he had also fought successfully for the unification of the 13 colonies, which had now become the 13 United States of America. Tom had said, "But that which most forcibly strikes a thoughtful and penetrating mind is the union of the States of America. On this our great national character depends. It is this which must give us importance abroad and security at home." And the state of New York, to its fortunate credit, recognizing Tom's deep, searching worth, made him a gift of this simple house. And Tom lived here at very lengthy intervals for the rest of his life. Thomas Paine was a man of enlightenment. Apart from the concept of universal democracy, his energy and imagination focused on science and mechanics. Now that the war for independence was over and won, Tom became an outstanding inventor. He proposed and designed a total rethinking of bridge building. His revolutionary bridge was made of iron, and it had one single span. His good friend Benjamin Franklin was, of course, also a distinguished inventor, and these two men, both so vital and essential to the best ideals of the United States of America, now spent much time poring over social and scientific problems. One day, here in America, these two great and good men exchanged memorable and significant words. Benjamin Franklin said, "Tom, where liberty is, there is my country." Thomas Paine must have looked very carefully at his old friend before he replied truthfully, "Where liberty is not, there is mine." Now that sentiment of Tom's is always the sentiment of an inspired group of human beings who are everlastingly vital to our good earthly hope. It is the sentiment of Jesus Christ, to the Mahatma Gandhi, of Martin Luther King, and that sentiment seems to lead inevitably towards martyrdom. And Tom Paine was to be no exception. His spirit drove him inexorably. He packed up the model of his precious bridge and leaving his beloved America, he sailed on the 26th of April, 1787 for France, where their terrible revolution was beginning to simmer. He was now 50 years old. When Thomas Paine arrived in France, he first hastened to his friend of 10 years' duration, Thomas Jefferson, who was now the American minister to the court of King Louis XVI. And Jefferson informed Paine about the state of the impending revolution. Of course, Thomas Paine was partly the fundamental cause of that French Revolution. His book, Common Sense, and indeed all of his Republican, democratic writings, composed over in America, had been smuggled into France in large quantities. Therefore, Tom Paine, here in Paris, at the outset of their revolution, was already a hero and was warmly accepted. The common people of France, known as the Third Estate, as against the First and Second Estates, representing the church and the nobles, were demanding a democratic share in a united National Assembly of the French nation. And when the aristocracy and the clergy refused this, the French Revolution was simply inevitable. On July the 14th, 1789, the Third Estate, the ordinary people, raided the infamous prison, often a political prison, known as the Bastille, and began to pull it apart. General Lafayette, a romantic French officer who had traveled to America to fight under George Washington against the British and who was now the commander of the National Guard of France, ceremoniously and symbolically presented the key of the vanquished Bastille prison to Thomas Paine for him to hand on to George Washington. And here is the key of the Bastille, hanging on a wall of George Washington's home at Mount Vernon, here in the United States of America. And towards the end of 1789, Thomas Jefferson left France for America. Thomas Paine was now the only American of stature left in Europe. Edmund Burke was one of the great deceivers in English history. His famous reputation was built on his well-expressed liberal sentiments, but Edmund Burke jeopardized his powerful potential for £1,500 per year, which came from King George III's treasury. You see, the anti-democratic influence here in Britain, personified by King George III, was worried that the popular revolution that had blazed across the 13 sometime British-American colonies and that had apparently sparked off the French Revolution might jump across the English Channel and engulf Britannia herself. The center of power in England was worried sick that true democracy, a democracy for all of the people, would reach our British shores. So, that English power center successfully corrupted Edmund Burke to the extent that he wrote a book which upheld the French monarchy and ridiculed the motto of the French Revolution, which at that time decently pleaded for liberty, equality, and fraternity. And when Tom Paine heard about Burke's composition, he crossed the English Channel with alacrity and chanced his liberal luck there, in the very bosom of his main enemy, England. Tom read Burke's words and considered them, and he began to write his reply. Tom Paine called this book The Rights of Man. And in this book, not only did he smash Burke into the ground where he belonged, but he also raised a banner which still braves the air above us today. That is, if we have the quality to see it. There it is, the rights of man. And of course, Tom Paine meant also the rights of woman. Tom Paine objected to Edmund Burke's conservative concept that the King of England's and the King of France's mighty establishments were fixtures that should not be shifted. Our Tom wrote, "There never did, nor can exist, any generation of men in any country possessed of the right of commanding forever how the world shall be governed, or who shall govern it. Man has no property in man, neither has any generation a property in the generations which are to follow." Tom then had a go at Burke on the subject of Britain's claimed constitution. A constitution is not a thing in name only, but in fact. It has not an ideal, but a real existence. And wherever it cannot be produced in a visible form, there is none. Can then Mr. Burke produce the English Constitution? If he cannot, we may fairly conclude that though the English Constitution has been so much talked about, no such thing as an English Constitution exists or ever existed, and consequently, the people of Britain have yet a constitution to form. And that pertains to this day. Then Thomas Paine turned to that privileged part of British and French government which Edmund Burke was arguing to be essential to national stability. Why does Mr. Burke talk of his House of Lords, his House of Peers, as the pillar of the landed interest? Were that pillar, the House of Lords, to sink into the earth, the same landed property would continue, and the same ploughing, sowing, and reaping would go on. Of course, to argue democratic reason in King George III's Britain could land you into uncomfortable trouble, as Tom Paine found out. And indeed, to argue reasonable fair play over in revolutionary France, once the ideals had got out of hand, could easily lead you to the guillotine, as Tom Paine was to find out. And even in New America, if you were constant in your reasoned idealism, as our Tom was, you could end your days as a rejected pariah, or at least a national embarrassment. as Tom Paine was to find out. In certain cases, the state, the establishment, would prefer you, if you were an ordinary person, a member of the third estate, as the French called it, the establishment would prefer you to remain in ignorance and not to ask any awkward questions. And they would also prefer none of us, like Tom Paine, to give any uncomfortable answers. Tom was worried about this in the 18th century, and some of us are worried about it today, here and now. Towards the end of his book, The Rights of Man, Tom Paine simply defined himself and what he stood for. He wrote, "Independence is my happiness. My country is the world, and my religion is to do good." Anyway, Tom was here in London, and the rights of man exploded over the nation. It is generally agreed that the publication of this book caused a bigger political furore than the publication of any other book in the whole history of Britain, yes, to this present day, and over 200,000 copies were sold. The British government organized, paid money to mobs throughout the country to insult the name of Thomas Paine. From the top of Britain to the bottom, they arranged that the rights of man should be burnt in public, and during this year, 1792, Tom Paine's effigy was burnt instead of Guy Fawkes on November the 5th. It was the measure of the British government's fear that Tom's simple democratic faith would overwhelm this British country of privilege. The Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, not a patch on his dad, incidentally, Pitt the Elder, Lord Chatham, had at least a vestige of honesty when he confessed. Tom Paine is quite right. But what am I to do? As things are, if I were to encourage his opinions, we should have a bloody revolution. And then Tom Paine summed up the ability of King George III and his undistinguished family. It requires some talents to be a common mechanic. But to be a king requires only the animal figure of man, a sort of breathing automaton. And on the general question of hereditary principles, Tom stated, "An hereditary governor is as inconsistent as an hereditary author. I know not whether Homer or Euclid had sons, but I will venture an opinion that if they had and had left their works unfinished, those sons could not have completed them." That did it. On May the 21st, 1792, Thomas Paine was summoned to attend a court of the King's Bench, and a royal proclamation was read prohibiting the sale of the rights of man. This indictment read, "Thomas Paine, late of London, gentleman, being a wicked, malicious, seditious, and ill-disposed person, and being greatly disaffected to our said sovereign lord, the now king, and to the happy constitution and government of the kingdom, did write and publish a certain false, scandalous, malicious, and seditious libel." Tom Paine was alarmingly fearless. he replied to that royal proclamation and his indictment, quote, "They have not only served as advertisements, but they have also excited a spirit of inquiry into the principles of government and a desire to read the rights of man in places where that spirit and that work were before unknown." Then Tom dangerously attended a meeting here in London of a group called the Friends of Liberty. He had already proposed a toast on behalf of democracy, which necessarily implied republicanism. He had raised his glass and had said, "To the revolution of the world, towards full democracy." Of course, there were British Home Office spies present. Tom was ever making big, powerful, ruthless enemies, but he was also surrounded by the best and finest liberal spirits in Britain. Nevertheless, it does appear as an astonishing fact that after the Friends of Liberty meeting, his chum, William Blake, whispered an awful warning. Yes, William Blake, the beautiful prophet, the great English visionary, whispered to Thomas Paine, "You must not go home, or if you do, you will be going to your death." Tom Paine had no wish to die in the Tower of London, so he made a circuitous dash for France. And as the ship that was carrying him back to France entered Calais harbor, military guns fired a salute in his honor, and French revolutionary soldiers escorted him to the town hall through the cheering populace. In France, Tom Paine was now the acknowledged inspiration to the hopes of democracy through revolution. On August the 26th, 1792, the National Assembly of France made him an honorary French citizen, and shortly afterwards he was elected to be a member of the French Convention, an institution which he himself had advocated. This French invitation stated, "Thomas Paine's love for humanity, for liberty and equality, the useful works that have issued from his heart and pen in their defense have determined our choice." And as Tom Paine took his seat here in this National Assembly of France, the members got to their feet and cheered him. The president had addressed Tom. "We take you to our bosom because it becomes the French nation that has proclaimed the rights of man to desire among her legislators he who first dared to estimate the consequences of those rights." Back in Britain, the government and its acolytes continued the virulent campaign against Thomas Paine. And then, on December the 18th, 1792, his trial began without his presence. It was held in the court of King's Bench with a pensioned judge, Lord Kenyon, presiding, and with a picked, bribed jury. Tom wrote a hair-raising letter to the British Attorney General, And these are Tom's words. That the English government is as great, if not the greatest, perfection of fraud and corruption that ever took place since government began is what you cannot be a stranger to, unless the constant habit of seeing it has blinded your sense. But though you may not choose to see it, the British people are seeing it very fast. Is it possible that you or I can believe that such a man as Mr. Guelph, that is what Tom Paine, like a good Republican, called King George III, is it possible that such a man as Mr. Guelph or any of his profligate sons, which included the Prince of Wales, is necessary to the government of a nation? The result of that trial was starkly obvious. Tom Paine was found guilty and was proclaimed an outlaw. Meanwhile, over here in France, on the 22nd of September 1792, the monarchy, the concept of a royal family, was abolished by the revolutionary government. Of course, Tom Paine, being a sound Republican, approved of this measure. But also there was political pressure building up to execute King Louis XVI. And Tom did not approve of that violent idea. And already it was becoming clear that anyone who opposed the extremists of the revolution, known as Jacobins, over any matter, leave alone the execution of their proud and miserable king, was in lethal danger. It was Tom Paine, the inspirer of American and French republicanism, who had the awesome nerve to stand up in this National Assembly of France and address those extremists, Danton, Marat, Robespierre, and company, on the subject of mercy and of the fate of their sometime king. These are Tom Paine's words. France has been the first of European nations to abolish royalty. Let her also be the first to abolish the death sentence. I vote for the perpetual banishment of Louis Capet, sometime King of France.
Marat replied,
I submit that Thomas Paine is incompetent to vote on this question. He's a Quaker. His mind is contracted by the narrow principles of his Christian religion. He is incapable of the liberality which is necessary for condemning men to death. My language has always been that of liberty and humanity, and I know that nothing so exalts a nation as the union of these two principles. Frenchmen are mad to allow foreigners to live among them. They should cut off the ears, let them bleed for a few days, and then cut off their heads.